As senior writers for Politico and co-authors of the indispensable Politico Playbook newsletter, Jake, Sherman, and Anna Palmer had inside access to the key figures involved in heated battles that defined the 2018 midterm elections. Their book is a detailed recreation and analysis of the no-holds-barred fight to control Congress, as well as a look at the major issues, debates, and intrigue that led up to it, covering the struggle between Paul Ryan and the conservative Freedom Caucus for control of the House, the sexual harassment allegations against Brett Kavanaugh, and various primaries across the country. The authors offer both astute political analysis and an unsettling portrait of today's tumultuous political landscape. They were in conversation with Hallie Jackson, chief White House correspondent for NBC News and an anchor for MSNBC. Thank you all so much for coming this evening. Please welcome Jake, Anna, and Hallie.
In a packed house for Jake and Anna's book. I was so thrilled when Jake and Anna asked me to moderate this event because I'm huge fans of theirs and huge fans of this book, which, have you guys read it yet? I know it's been out for a couple of days. Nobody? Great. So that's good, because we're going to talk about it. So I got to know Anna when she started coming on my show for MSNBC, and I was so impressed with not only what a great personality she was, but what a great journalist she was, and also really fun to talk to during commercial breaks and behind the scenes, and just sort of a delight to be around. Jake, I don't know if you remember this. You and I met years ago.
When you were a Connecticut local.
You do remember, yeah. I was doing local news reporting for stations all across the country. And we would call up this young cub Politico reporter, Jake Sherman, and do these soundbite interviews with him in the Capitol. And they would air on like WCVB in Boston and all over the country. So full circle now, here we are talking about this fantastic book. So these two, great people, great journalists, and now great authors. And I'm so excited to be able to talk with you about that. Talk with you about it, I guess. Great. So here's what I think how we're going to play this thing is we want to give you guys plenty of time to be able to ask Anna and Jake questions because I imagine you have some and plenty for them. But I also wanted to talk about some of the really interesting scenes that you write about in the book and then go behind the scenes a little bit to talk to you about the process, what it was like to put this together because it is a huge undertaking for both of you. So there's this great anecdote in the book where Jake and Anna talk about the president involved in this meeting with members of the Republican Party. It's on infrastructure. They're at Camp David, and the president is scrawling notes furiously. And somebody finally sees these notes, and instead of taking copious notes on infrastructure, the president wrote Sloppy Steve Bannon, and a list of ways he was going to go after his former chief strategist in the media moments later, which he did. And Jake and Anna write how there was a way for the GOP to keep power if only the president would listen, which at the time he wasn't doing. So let's start there. Let's talk about whether you think the president has learned to listen to the Republican Party or if the Republican Party in the age of Trump has bent to the president.
Well, thank you for saying all those nice things, Hallie. I hope a quarter of them are true. I think that was one example, a very prominent, although untold until this book came out, example of how the president kind of operates in his own psychic sphere. Meaning Kevin McCarthy, the House Republican leader, now the number one House Republican leader, then the number two, gathered House Republican leadership and Senate Republican leadership at Camp David for a kind of come to Jesus meeting, so to speak, about the party's political prospects in the November elections. This was January 2018. And they were going over all of these agenda items, which in McCarthy's mind and the Republican leadership's mind would help Republicans at the ballot box, an infrastructure package. McCarthy wanted the president to focus on small things and make them look big, like Bill Clinton did in his mind in the 90s. And instead of focusing on this stuff, Donald Trump was in his own world about to, and we took this word out of the book because Anna rightly thought no one knows what it meant, but he was ready to slag Steve Bannon, which isn't a word, I don't think, so we took it out of the book.
I win some arguments.
Most arguments you win. So I think the party has bent to him. One thing that always comes up that Anna and I talk about, or have talked about a lot since this book came back, is when we started covering Republicans when we were covering Republicans in 2009, 2010, they were maniacally focused on deficit reduction. Now that's not issue 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 10 for congressional Republicans. So I think the party is completely bent to him.
There's another interesting relationship you explore, a couple of them with a former speaker and a current speaker, Paul Ryan and Nancy Pelosi. And there's a lot in the book devoted to the president's relationship with Paul Ryan. You describe in some instances, and it was a roller coaster, right? It started off very poorly. It improved over time. It sounds like it ended very poorly. And in the middle, there were screaming matches with Paul Ryan and Donald Trump on the phone, Ryan literally yelling at the president, "Why are you popping off at me?" And the president trying to explain some of this. And Anna, talk through that relationship, what you discovered in your reporting, and whether it matters now that it ended on such a low note.
Yeah, so I think oftentimes we forget that going into the 2016 election, Paul Ryan did not endorse the president. He had a famously bad relationship with him. He didn't like his politics. He didn't like his personal politics as well. And he, at one point, even disinvited him to come to Wisconsin when the president was supposed to do a rally. And so he goes, I think it was kind of like an existential crisis of whether or not he was going to continue as speaker after Donald Trump won or not, because basically it was a referendum on his politics, where the party is now and where Paul Ryan was in terms of tax reform, in terms of, government spending and things that he'd spent his entire career on. That is not where this Republican Party is. And so I think it was interesting to see the ebbs and flows of that. And when we sat down with the president, we were talking about his relationship with Paul Ryan after he had announced his decision to step down and after the election. And we said, oh yeah, I remember how he wasn't really with me. He said, yeah, we used to call him Foxhole Paul on the campaign trail because he was never really with me in the foxhole. And so you just couldn't have two more different people, I think, in terms of how they approach problems, in terms of how they approach a lot of life. And what was more stunning to me than anything is that Paul Ryan really kept his mouth shut about a lot of their differences.
You were surprised by that?
Yeah, I think they really felt he and Mitch McConnell, I think, oftentimes are at odds behind the scenes, but learned very quickly that they could get a lot more done having arguments privately with the president than going off on Twitter or in public television appearances.
By the way, that took some time for Ryan. He at the beginning had no problem popping off on Trump, and as Anna said, he kind of realized later that more productive to do it behind the scenes. But put yourself in Ryan's mind for a second if you can, and I assume most people cannot, but I will describe his mindset. Which was, this is a guy who spent literally his entire career telling voters and telling his members of his party and the other party that he was going to be the responsible steward of government. Republicans were sober leaders and mild-mannered and fiscally responsible and all this stuff. And then comes Donald Trump, who basically rejected that view of republicanism. So, Ryan, as Anna said, had a fork in the road, right? Leave or get on board.
Right. And he made his decision, and he also made his decision to step away from the speakership before Republicans lost the House. And Nancy Pelosi comes on board. And the president, notably, never gave her a nickname, still hasn't. We had Crazy Bernie today from the president in a tweet, Sloppy Steve, as we've talked about. There's a slew of them, but not for Nancy Pelosi. And there's a scene that you write about how it was an interview with the president, how he said, if Nancy Pelosi needed the votes, I would have gotten her the votes. The president, explain what the president's referring to there. And spoiler alert, I had Anna and Jake on our show today in advance of this event talking about this. And Anna, you said something that Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump are the two most diametrically opposed people that you could think of. I mean, you couldn't pick two more different people out of a hat.
Yeah, no, I think it was interesting.
Or out of earth.
I think what's interesting about the president and Nancy Pelosi is he clearly has a respect and almost a reverence for her in a way that you don't see with basically any other political figure that he deals with, and at least we talk to him about. I think the fact that Nancy Pelosi is able to keep her troops together. He said in this interview with us, Democrats are lousy, they're lousy politicians, but he was jealous of how they follow her down that road and they stick together. And I think he wishes that Republicans would do that for him. And time again, they clearly haven't. So I think what's interesting about Nancy Pelosi is she has stood up to him eye to eye and she doesn't blink. And he has twice now, whether it was a shutdown or government spending deal, he's the one who has backed down.
She has been, and you write about this, she seemed at times surprised by the fact that the president didn't back down and blink.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the White House made a calculation at the end of, we have this amazing quote from Mark Meadows, who was the chairman. I mean, everyone knows we're in D.C. I forgot about that. I don't have to explain who people are. He's during the shutdown. He says, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, this is not a battle for the policies, or it's a battle for the policies, but it's also a battle for who's going to be more powerful, Donald Trump or Nancy Pelosi. And he said, if Donald, the point being, if Donald Trump backed out of a government shutdown without getting his border wall at the end of 2018, that Nancy Pelosi would be the most powerful person in D.C. And Donald Trump opened the government without getting anything for his border wall. And you're right. The White House thought that Nancy Pelosi could not sustain the position that she wasn't going to give money for a border wall with Mexico, and Nancy Pelosi just did it without breaking a sweat. And I think Donald Trump wasn't expecting that and didn't know how to handle that. And I think he doesn't understand, as Anna said, how she's able to keep her troops together.
It is an interesting dynamic to watch them, Anna. You describe it as kind of a reverence, or this sort of looking and wondering how do you get that power for unity over your party when this is not something that this president has. You mentioned Mark Meadows. So let's talk about Mark Meadows and some others a little bit here, because he comes up a couple of times, many times in the book. Specifically, what was intriguing to me on a conference call where Paul Ryan, Donald Trump, Mark Meadows are all talking about healthcare. So they're all on the phone, they're going through policies, they're talking about this, and somebody chimes in. And it's not, an advisor to the president, Mark Short, it's not Shahir Knight, it's Sean Hannity, the Fox host, who listens in, as Anna and Jake report, on these calls with the president. Now, we've known that Sean Hannity is close with President Trump. That's a known fact. The president and Hannity himself will talk about it, right? We know the president watches his show because he tweets about it. What's interesting is that he also apparently gives his policy advice on calls, not just with the president, but with other members of Congress and these top Republican lawmakers. It's pretty stunning. I mean, it's unlike anything I have ever covered or even as a student of Congress, heard about, that a actual personality, a newscast host would be on actual conversations about how Republicans are going to, what their strategy is going to be. What we found more than just in that call is, during the shutdown, during a lot of these really tense fights over the last 2.5 years, Jim Jordan or Mark Meadows would get out of those meetings and then directly pick up the phone and call him. So I think whether you love it or hate it, what it really shows is his influence. And it's not just it's not just him speaking on television and the president and other Republicans, receiving that information. It is a two-way street, and they're having a dialogue. It
also just it underscores what we all kind of know instinctively, which is the power of television in this administration. There's two types of powers of television, I think. There's Sean Hannity, who is literally speaking about strategy with Republican members of Congress and then going on his television show and talking about those policies as a seemingly detached observer. Hannity did not talk to us for this book and was not interested in talking to us. The people who he spoke to all spoke to us, but he did not speak to us. And also, I would say the other way Washington has changed a lot that we document in the book is that the president does things for the flair he believes it gives him on television. We have an anecdote in the book that was also reported elsewhere subsequently, or at the same time almost, about how after Trump had Pelosi and Schumer at the White House for this meeting before the shutdown, I guess, he spoke to Paul Ryan afterwards, and Paul Ryan was like, "That was terrible. Like, what were you doing?" And Trump said, "This is why I was so great at The Apprentice. We got great reviews." And Ryan said, "What ratings are you talking about? They don't give meetings ratings." And Trump said, "Everything has ratings." And it's easy to laugh at that, but that is really his frame of reference for meetings.
But also, he's not necessarily wrong, and that all the cable networks took that meeting. Remember that one in the Oval Office? It took it live.
Yeah.
It was a rated meeting.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe he was right. Maybe they did get good ratings. But he does view things for the kind of Hollywood flair he believes it will deliver.
We're diverging a little to the second half of the conversation, but given that you brought up the president's sort of propensity for television, did you find that your frequent television appearances helped you in this book?
Yeah, I guess theoretically.
I think in the sense that I think we were helped by a couple things. One, most people that write books about Congress or books in Washington kind of parachute in and they don't know the characters. I think we've all been covering. I covered Nancy Pelosi's first speakership as a daily reporter. And so I think we've been around these people for a long time. So there was a lot of buy-in on that. But I do think in this White House and with our day job writing Playbook every day, we have a profile that people know, and that he likes that. He wants to be, more than probably anyone. The president loves to engage with reporters.
Yeah, I did find him, as Anna said, I found him to be quite engaging personally when we sat down with him. I don't have any sense that he did this because of television. The way we got the interview was actually quite interesting. We had no luck for 6 months. And by the way, we were talking, as we note in the book, with members of Congress every week, sometimes multiple times a week, from December 2016, basically, or election day 2016 through February 2019. So we didn't even calculate how many hours, but it's untold amount of hours of interviews with members of Congress who all were happy to participate. But we tried to get with the president. The press office basically said, yes, he'd like to do it, but could never find the time. And I understand he's a busy guy. And then Woodward's book came out. Woodward's book came out, and he didn't get an interview, but he noted that Trump told him, you just have to email my secretary. And so we emailed the secretary. And she said, well, I'll put it in front of the president. No guarantees. And then we got an interview.
What's so interesting about that? The president was upset that he says he was upset that he had never heard from Bob Woodward from his book. And he said, well, of course I would have sat down with you. I would have wanted the opportunity to talk. So I wonder, and he kind of threw Raj Shah, then the deputy press secretary, under the bus and said, who's Raj? I never heard from Raj. What do you mean? Worked for him. So I wonder if
Not
that
any
played
longer.
into it. Right. No longer does. There's somebody else inside the president's orbit that a lot of people sort of look at and wonder about, that you report out on, Jared Kushner, in a light that is, just based on the reporting, not perceived as so favorable to Kushner. He is seen by critics as having this level of naivete that is just sort of next level, if you will. There was a scene in which Jared Kushner tells the late Senator John McCain, sort of very earnestly, it seems, we're going to change the way that government works. And Senator McCain just looks at him and goes, good luck, son. Do you think... So on the one hand, seen as kind of the naive son, right? The naive prince, if you will, by critics. On the other hand, he has amassed a lot of power inside the West Wing, and he has a lot of influence and a lot of sway. How do Republicans that you talk to outside the White House square that?
Yeah, I think you summed it up rightly. I think Jared Kushner to me is a lot of how a lot of the Trump allies who came to Washington, who had no experience in government, came here thinking like, we're going to change the way Washington works, and it's going to just, we're going to rewrite the way this business is done. Washington's dysfunctional, but we've come in, we've won this election that no one thought we could win, and now, this is going to be our town, and clearly that didn't happen. I do think that a lot of privately members of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, kind of roll their eyes at Jared Kushner.
Still to this day.
He's got Middle East peace on his plate. He's got criminal justice. He's got,
China, Mexico.
Everything, right? It's
All
like,
of the
there's a
world's
problem.
vexing
Jared
problems.
Kushner is going to be the guy who's going to come in and save it. And while criminal justice reform did happen, I would say it was teed up very much so in the previous administration and by a lot of other people for a long time. So I think that there's a lot of eye rolling in the Capitol when it comes to like Jared's here to save the day. Whether it was most recently on immigration reform that he was going to be the guy that's going to figure it out.
Yeah, the government was literally minutes, if my memory serves me well, it's in the book, from shutting down, and Kushner kind of blew into this meeting with Paul Ryan, Kevin McCarthy, and Steve Scalise and said, sorry, I wasn't engaged until now. I've been busy with criminal justice reform, but I'll be able to fix this quite quickly. And that's how he believes that he's uniquely...
Paul Ryan, and you're right that they were like, are you kidding?
Yeah.
Right. It's like that people just can't,
Yeah, I think he views himself as uniquely qualified to handle these problems, although there's no convincing evidence that he is. And I think just one thing to note, we weren't, like, this was not a book. There are Republicans who come across great in this book, Democrats who come across great, and vice versa, right? And the president, according to a couple of the reviews, people
You're not
were
supposed to read those.
People, yeah, I know. Trust me.
Tough.
Trust me. Comes across as, in the reviews, it says that the book is not negative about the president. He's portrayed as genial, if not a bit bumbling, is how one review put it, I think. So we try to let the stories and the anecdotes tell about these people. It's a long arc from election day 2016 through February 2019. So people have ample chance to make their case about who they are in this system of government. And Kushner, I think, believed for whatever reason that he was uniquely suited to qualify, uniquely suited to fix problems he wasn't really qualified to fix.
It's a great point, and I think an important one too, and that you guys don't, you don't have a perspective here other than here's the stories that we have heard. You really had this amazing fly on the wall access, right? Yes. You talk about how you had, talk about it here, memos, emails, recordings. You talked about hours and hours and hours of interviews with these major players. Can you talk a little bit about how you got that kind of access, what you think helped to get you that?
So I think a couple of things. One, I think I mentioned a little bit before, we've been here a long time. A lot of the main characters in leadership and their staff knows us very well. So
You've been covering Congress since 2004, right? And Jake since about 2009.
Yep. Yes.
So I think that was one of the benefits. I think also there's so much focus on the White House all the time.
Oh, I know.
And
by you.
And there are 535 members of Congress, senators and House members, who are in a lot of meetings and have a lot of thoughts and don't feel like they get enough attention. And so when you say, hey, we're going to tell this story and we want to really understand, and we had a lot of history writing what we call in journalism TikToks, kind of the behind the scenes recreation of massive deals that either happened or broke down. And so they kind of knew, we're like, this is what we want to do. We want to have this kind of lens of a TikTok, but for 2 years. And so I think there was a real comfort there, a level of knowing that we were going to, we didn't promise anybody you're going to come off good in this book, but that we were going to be honest and we were just going to report, what actually happened.
And I also think people didn't really have a choice because most meetings on Capitol Hill have 5, 6 to 200 people, right? There are very few one-on-one meetings, and even in one-on-one meetings, there was always a sense that someone would be participating, not for any other reason, but again, these were people that we knew for a long time, and no one on Capitol Hill keeps their mouth shut. Everyone tells somebody about something. And so you pick up, when you're up there, I'm up there every day, Anna's up there a lot, and we just pick up on a lot. You just pick up on little bits of information that we had a file for 2.5 years or multiple files where we kind of did timelines and filled in detail. So it became inevitable.
And we benefited too, I think, because the embargo was nothing, none of these interviews were going to become public until the book published. And so if you're in a political world, I think people were just so much more honest because it wasn't going to impact the next vote. It wasn't going to impact the election. All of this information was going to be saved until months after the election.
And we also traveled with members of Congress, which is great to get them away from this climate. I went to visit Jim Jordan at his house in Ohio, and we traveled with a bunch of congressional leaders over multiple trips. So getting them away from this climate and just showing the commitment, I think, was a big deal to many of them.
Yeah, it's interesting because the sort of access piece of it is obviously a powerful tool, and it has been. There's also this generalized, I think, critique in Washington that it can at times make you too close to your sources, make you too insular, too inside the bubble.
Yeah.
How did you grapple with that?
These aren't my friends. I have friendly relationships with them because I've known them and they know I'm not I wouldn't be suited to write a book about the Fed, right? This is a book that I'm suited to write about because I've covered it for a while. I'm not friends with Paul Ryan. We don't have lunch. But we've both written lots of stories that are sharply critical of them. I guess I understand intellectually the access journalism thing, but I guess I don't line up with it exactly. I just think that you get access because of fair coverage. Yes, some people are soft on people, and I don't think that's us. And that's evidenced by the fact that both parties gave us access and believed that we were going to be honest brokers about this interesting period of time.
What has surprised you most about the writing of the book and the reaction to it?
I'll let you start.
Yeah. It was a lot of work.
That was surprising to you?
No.
It was more work than I anticipated, I think. Neither of us had been through the process before. We didn't take book leave. We have a very demanding job. We write 2 newsletters a day and do a lot of other things, live events and other things. So I also think we didn't know what the narrative arc of the story was. We were writing and reporting it in real time. And so you had kind of these vignettes and interesting moments, and you'd be reporting separately or together, and you're like, oh, that's good, that's gonna be, and you're just hoping, praying that these nuggets wouldn't show up in the newspaper the next day.
Yeah. What happens when they did?
They didn't really, for the most part. A few here and there, but very few of them. And you kind of know the tent poles. We knew Election Day 2016, Election Day 2018, Paul Ryan's retirement, tax reform, would all be big parts. We did not plan on doing anything with any Supreme Court nomination. And then came Brett Kavanaugh and how Republicans got his nomination through, which we knew we had to be drag kicking and screaming because it was a whole new line of reporting with a whole new set of sources.
Or sexual harassment.
Yeah, or
there's
sexual.
A lot, there was these through lines that were culturally happening, in the
And you can't predict
country,
them.
and you can't predict them. And all of a sudden, you have to think, okay, like how are we going to come into this, differently, or how are we going to tell the story from the perspective in the Capitol?
The Me Too movement happened as you were writing and reporting out this book.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about Kavanaugh, which was, kind of the pinnacle of this entire 2-year period in that realm, is we interviewed Mitch McConnell about it, and there was this desire from our editor, who's great, Kevin Doughton at Crown, who doesn't live here, so he's not a DC person. He lives in New York, but he loves this stuff, and he really wanted to get at like what Mitch McConnell was feeling, like he had to have felt bad about, or he had to have some sort of emotion that we don't understand. And we sat down with him and we kind of said, we said, listen, tell us how you feel about this whole Kavanaugh episode. And he said, I'll tell you how I feel. For 2 weeks, every speech I gave was televised. My approval rating among Republicans went from 30 to 60. I know all these talk show hosts dump on me all the time for being a rhino, but for now I'm a superstar, or I'm a rock star. And that's how he felt. That was his takeaway from the Kavanaugh episode, which, we never even anticipated to get into any of that stuff. And then it ended up being this huge cultural moment, which kind of came to a climax with a Supreme Court nomination. So I guess that's the unpredictable nature of this kind of stuff.
How did you guys, as a duo, write this? Was this like a chapter-to-chapter kind of thing? Did you co-report, solo report, come back, compare notes? Walk us through that.
Honestly, all of it. I don't think there's a formula. We've been writing partners for a really long time before we did Playbook, so I think we know our strengths and our weaknesses, and also like what our interests are. But we did a ton of interviews together. We did a ton of interviews just by nature of it separately. We wrote together. We wrote separately. We put words into drafts. The process was, after being a daily reporter for so long, where you're just churning and burning content, is like, we had this great editor and Jake and myself looking at it, and you're like, wow, this is like the 6th edit. How can you have another thought on this paragraph? Like, I have no other thoughts on this paragraph. Like, it can be improved. It's just kind of stunning how much time and effort goes into really the storytelling aspect of it, which was something that for myself anyway, probably for Jake too, like we had not spent a ton of time doing.
Also, like, we just have different relationships with different people. So I might do one trip with one member of Congress. I might do one interview because I see somebody in the halls or something like that. But we kept all of our recordings, all of our notes, which will go in the Jake Sherman Presidential Library or something. Which I actually probably have. Yeah, my mom's basement, right? My parents' basement. But no, it was challenging, especially over that time period, because again, you're writing a book where you don't know the ending, you know the beginning, you don't know what the climax is, and you don't really know where the characters will end. But we were lucky narratively that Paul Ryan retired, Republicans lost the House, because that, and I'm not saying politically, but like that helps the story, right? That you're writing a story about how a city has changed and the city, the people in power lost power.
Oh, and you have like Nancy Pelosi's return from the brink of destruction. I think that we got really lucky. And I will say this: I'm not pro or against legislation, but the shutdown was the first time I've ever really felt like, okay, guys, we need to figure this out because the book is due and we need an ending. Like every day, you're like, here's 6 ways the shutdown could end in Playbook. Like, just trying to pick anyone. It's time to be done.
You talk about how much of a challenge it was, and I'll be honest, I'm in awe of both of you because you mentioned this, Anna, neither of you took book leave. So you were not only doing your full-time job, writing Playbook, writing pieces for Politico, coming on my show and other shows on cable, doing everything that you do, having a personal life, right? I know you're both of your partners are here in the audience, which is exciting. How did you do that? And was there ever a point where you were like, what the hell did I get myself into?
I have a very nice wife.
But how did you balance that? You both have, families that you care about and want to spend time with, but this book, I'm assuming, was just all encompassing.
Yeah, it was. It's not easy to do this by any stretch. And it's the crazy thing is it really sticks with you at all times because, you're always wondering what you're missing. And like, you're away from the Capitol for a day and, is there a meeting that's happening that you should know about? And if you don't know about it, how will you get information from it? And it's just, you kind of have to, the story, you have to write the story that you want to write. And you have to be, and this took me a while, and Anna's heard this a million times, but I drove myself crazy not knowing what I didn't know. And because you're writing a book and you want it to be true to the people who are working on Capitol Hill and involved in it. Like, I heard from somebody who's a main character in the book who read our excerpt. I don't think he's read the book yet. And he was like, wow, how did you know all that stuff? And this is someone who was involved in the stuff I was writing about. So you want it to be true to those people and you want it to be entertaining to the outside world. And that's really tough.
I think we both benefit from having super supportive partners. And I think, I do think it was nice to have somebody else in the foxhole with you. I mean, to be honest, like, you're rarely both in like the worst place, and you kind
Except
of balance each other off
here and there.
But I mean, you really have somebody to balance it out, and somebody to talk to. I mean, Jake and I probably start G-chatting at about 4 a.m. every day, right? So, you have somebody who you feel like is with you the whole way, and you're not going to kind of be out there by yourself.
Love that. Just a couple more quick ones, then we'll get to audience questions. I'm curious to know, you write in the book that you interviewed almost everyone you wanted to interview. And you say almost. Who was left? Who did you not talk to that you would have wanted to talk to?
Sean Hannity.
He's the one.
And it's his choice. And I think some people, and I've heard from some people after the book who were upset about their depiction in the book. Not Sean Hannity.
Can you share?
And I don't want to share that one. But people actually recognize that if they didn't talk, it didn't turn out as well as it could have for them. Because I told this to many people throughout the process, I'm writing the story, so I don't know why you wouldn't want your point of view in it, but that's your choice. And some people took that choice or didn't want to talk about things, and then afterwards said, how did you have this information? And I said, well, we talked about it 3 or 4 times, and you didn't want to talk about it, so that's kind of your choice.
We told you we were going to be writing about it, too.
Yeah. So it's probably as far as I should go.
Let me ask you this. Jake, you said something, but Anna, I want to also get your reaction to something that Jake said, which was you were talking to Terry Gross, I think, over at NPR about the book. Fabulous interview. And Jake, who's a great book interviewer as well. And Jake, you said the one thing that you learned from this book is that politicians exist in a political moment, meaning they act the way they do because of the political dynamics at any one moment. And you've also learned that politicians are there to gain power, keep power, and increase power. And whatever they have to do it, they will. Do you think, both of you, that writing this book has made you more cynical about politics as it exists in Washington, or more realistic about it?
I think we were already probably pretty cynical about politics. I think a lot of people have asked me, is this an optimistic book? Like, I think people want optimism in the world right now. And I would say I think it's a very realistic depiction of what happens when members of Congress and when people come to Washington, what their focus is on. But yeah, I mean, I agree with what he said there. I mean, I think we've said that a lot about, getting power, obtaining more power, growing power.
I would say a few things. People oftentimes mistake the media as being an entity that should foster an environment that's conducive for legislating. That's not my job. That's members of Congress's job. My job is to tell people what's happening. And my job is to reveal information that members of Congress do not want to be revealed, because that information benefits the public. They're working for us, not for each other. So optimism, as Anna said, is not, if you want to be optimistic, if you read it and want to be optimistic, that's up to you, that you could be optimistic or pessimistic. One criticism we got, and I think we've heard it a few times, is that this book short sells the people who are there to enact good policies. Fair. That's a fair criticism. I would say that the majority of, members of Congress might say, I don't want to get into the politics. Of course they do. They're members of Congress. They create, I think this is what Mitch McConnell says, they create policy in a political environment. I'm not sure that's McConnell, but somebody always says that on Capitol Hill. So that's kind of the reality of our system, good or bad. It hasn't, I've often thought about this because we've just been covering this for so long. Like, it's probably been too much to say it's a love letter to Congress, but it's definitely an ode to this crazy system that we have, which is, I think, we always say it's like House of Cards, but real and even more interesting, and it is.
These are real people who are doing these things. They're not characters.
They're going to be a sequel.
Hey, look at the time. It's so weird. It got late really quickly.
We want to make sure we have some time to take some audience questions, so that's the last one from me. But I know that you guys probably have a million, so it's Justin, do we have a mic, or how does that work? Great.
Yeah, I'll be coming around with the microphone, so just raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll try to find you.
Thank you. I'm very curious. There are two questions, really, one comment. Did you find any of the interviews that the people expressed regret of where they are, what they did, how they behaved, and so forth? And just a quick comment, I read you twice a day.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You reported this week, I think, or last couple of days, about Trump thinking about making Ivanka the World Bank, and his comment was, because she's good with numbers.
Well, I just want to give some credit.
Yeah.
Elena Plott, who conveniently has disappeared, but she was here 1 second ago. That was her story in the Atlantic, which, again...
What you covered or reported it, because I don't read the Atlantic. I just wanted to know how that came about.
Elena, he does read the Atlantic. He doesn't want to be... doesn't want to brag. I don't think anyone expressed regret. Do you think so? Did people? You think? Okay, we'll say. I don't know.
No, I don't want to review. I mean, I think if it did make in the book, some of the stuff is not really attributable. But I do think people look back on some of the races and different decisions that were made. And
tactical decisions.
Decisions. Looking back, we're thinking maybe it wasn't the right decision. You know, they felt like they did the right thing at that time, but in retrospect, would have changed.
Yeah, I think there were some people who, at the end of the campaign, I know what you're talking about, but maybe I don't. One thing that comes to mind is some outside groups at the end of toward election day turned very negative and ran ads that we thought, and we didn't have to think. It was plainly obvious that we're dishonest, intellectually dishonest. Both parties do it, so I'm not. This time it was Republicans. Next time it'll be Democrats. And I think some people were regretful that those groups did that. I don't think maybe the people who did them were as regretful, but that's one instance.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
In a presumably alternative universe where Trump gets tired of dealing with laws and quote-unquote presidential harassment, decides to A-pardon himself and then be quit, what percentage of Republicans, after they express public sorrow and outrage and whatever, do you think would go back to a restaurant, a bar, and pop the corks on the champagne?
I will say this, which becoming a politician and not answering answer, but I do think is true, which I think we've talked to a lot of members privately, what they will say is, and I don't even think it's just this president, I think it's other presidents that they may disagree with. There were certainly a lot of Democrats that had not a lot of love lost for Obama when he was president, and I think the real sentiment is, I was here before him, I'm going to be here after him. And I think that is the true testament of where a lot of members see that their careers are going to be 10, 20 years long and have a much longer legacy in some ways than a president who's going to be here 4 years or 8 years.
But something that Hallie said, she quoted the fresh air thing, let's just be honest, the president he says 90-something% approval among Republicans. It's not that high, but among Republican voters, he has very high approval ratings. And
Close to 90.
Yeah, it's probably in the high 80s. So members of Congress go home. Again, they exist in the political moment. They go home and they go to talk to constituents who are saying, in many cases, why aren't you standing up to Trump even more?
Standing with him.
Yeah, standing with him even more. And I know in D.C. and in New York and in L.A. and San Francisco, people say, well, aren't these guys going to be happy when he's gone? No, the answer is a lot of them like him. and a lot of them exist in constituencies where he's incredibly popular. And that's a function not only of the political moment, but a function of gerrymandering, a function of the way the districts are drawn, and I think that gets lost a lot.
And I would just say, I'll just add on that because I agree with everything you said, but I think also you have to realize that this president, unlike any other president, like gets on the phone and calls rank and file House members and asks their opinions of policy, of politics, of all kinds of things in a way that normally it's all very top-down leadership, talking to the speaker, talking to the majority leader. And so a lot of these people are empowered in a way, if you're a Republican House member, that has never happened before.
Hallie, do you want to choose? Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you for coming. Great. Looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
You talk a lot about, I think exclusively about interviewing members of Congress. At some point, those members have to interact with the administration. And I haven't read the book yet. So how does it connect what you're learning from the Congress folks with the White House? Did you actually interview anyone at the White House?
The president.
We interviewed a lot of people in the White House. A lot of people in the White House. A lot of people in different agencies.
Were they willing
Yes.
to talk with you?
Yeah, of
Yes.
course. Yeah.
Many of them have, and this is another not misnomer, but I think another. Most people in this administration, or many people in this administration, I don't want to say most, have worked in Washington for a long time. It's not like Trump, sent everyone from the Trump organization, come down to D.C. and we're taking over the government. He had a lot of people in positions throughout the administration that had worked on Capitol Hill, that had worked at Treasury. I mean, these are people who are well practiced at talking to reporters. And even though the president is outwardly hostile toward the press, many people in this administration, most people that I deal with, are not. And I think Hallie would say, in many cases, that's what you experience with aides, right? That they're more than willing to talk to the press.
Yeah, I think behind closed doors, that's certainly something that you see. And I would just also note this is a president who likes to talk to the media, not in formal briefing settings, right?
Yep.
We've had 2 this year so far in the White House. There were 34 by this point last year at the White House, just to give you a sense of the difference. But this is a president who likes to engage a lot. I'm actually, I do think the Woodward book for the president, from what I've understood, was a turning point for him in talking to. There's a lot of books coming out. I think this is one of the best ones. But
Thank you.
And I think that
Me too.
knows. I think he understands that he's got to talk to these reporters because Jake and Anna are going to write this book whether they sat down with the president or not.
Yeah.
Anna, thanks for being a geopolitics film.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, the title of the book, it sort of seems more like a question to me, which is there a hill that members won't be willing to die on? And what do you think about that moving forward? It seems like we've seen some signs that maybe there are recently. Foreign policy, nominations, and others.
Very good question.
Yeah, no, I think we probably more recently, the last couple months than in the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, have seen more, particularly in the Senate, Republicans stand up to the president, whether it's on healthcare with Mitch McConnell saying, okay, yeah, you should go work with Nancy Pelosi on that, or on the national emergency down at the border wall, where you had a lot of Republicans very uncomfortable with what the president was doing in terms of trying to take powers when Congress said no in terms of money for that. We saw this with the Federal Reserve Board, Herman Cain, a lot of things like that. So I do think there are certain things right now where you're having Republicans exercise some points of power to stop the president on things.
Yeah, and the title was meant as like, remember, we were mainly focusing on 2016 to 2018. This book, you could write this book in perpetuity, right? Our government's not going to stop.
Same me the job for the rest of our lives.
And there were a lot of hills that they did die on. Immigration was a hill Republicans died on from 2016 to 2019. So within that context, it made sense. But you're right. You're correctly observing that there are hills that they're not willing to die on anymore. Yeah.
I think we have time for a few more questions.
So I'm a reporter by background, so that's kind of where this is coming from. I'm curious. So I haven't read the book yet, but the book, I'm assuming talks a little about how Congress has changed and how politicians have changed. But as reporters who do this every day, how has Trump becoming president and his obviously outward criticism of the press, has that changed at all how the media landscape has worked in your mind, or how you've gone about your reporting and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think the president has broken a lot of norms and attacked a lot of institutions. And I think we don't know what the tail of that is. How long and the impact of that, I think, will be something that we will kind of be able to look at back at 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Do things normalize after he is no longer leader of the United States? But I do think, and we've talked a lot about this, as much as the president attacks the news and fake news and things like that, I feel like in the Capitol, Republicans are just as likely to talk to you as Democrats are, and they do not, for the vast majority of them, are not critical in the way or trying to, berate the media. I think you have to realize when there's so many of them, they realize that like being in print, being on air is oxygen to their political life, and they need that.
I would say one thing from a process point of view, what we kind of illustrate throughout this book is that no one speaks for the president besides the president. I mean, they told us they weren't going to shut down the government. You know this better than anybody. I don't care. I don't want to say I don't care, but it's not gospel when the White House press office says something. They said last week that he wasn't considering busing undocumented immigrants to sanctuary cities, and then he tweeted that he was. So, I mean, that's a challenging thing as a reporter, just from a process point of view, because it's not like I could text the president and be like, hey, is this, and we're members of Congress. Many of them communicate with us on text message or email, and you could get to the principal very easily in the Capitol. You can't get to the principal when it's the president. He's the only one who talks for himself.
Yeah, I call it the grain of salt caveat all the time. And every
or the pound of salt caveat, yeah.
Could you speculate a little bit about what the... I know, I'm sorry.
No, please don't make me.
How you think the first 2 years of the Trump presidency might have been different under a Speaker John Boehner as opposed to Paul Ryan?
It's a great question. Sure. I mean, John Boehner and Donald Trump were very close friends and were for many years. John Boehner was in touch, and I don't know if it ended up in the book, but it is in the book. He did speak to the president on many occasions. Many people at the White House who are top aides to the president, a few, worked for John Boehner. So he clearly appreciated that orbit's vibe. I don't know. I mean, John Boehner and Paul Ryan. John Boehner and Paul Ryan are totally different people. Boehner fashions himself a deal maker like the president and has had a bit more success than the president, although not a ton more success. Tough to say. I mean, we did think about that at various points.
It's tough, though, because you have to realize that you can't really take him out of the context of the overall House Republican landscape, which is they were going to eject him out of the speakership. Yeah. So as far as the concept of, yes, did John Boehner love to cut deals? Did he often go to the White House and talk to, Barack Obama, try to cut, a major, kind of spending situation? Yeah, like that did happen, but he couldn't, I don't think, be effective in the current makeup of what the House Republican Caucus conference looks like.
And one point we make briefly in the book is that Paul Ryan basically said he was going to change the composition, not the composition, but he was going to change the problems that House Republicans had. He was going to solve them. Paul Ryan said that when he became Speaker. There wasn't going to be as much internal fighting and things like that. And he came in and it was the same stuff. So the same problems that John Boehner had were, I would argue, exacerbated under Paul Ryan in many, many ways.
Hi. As reporters, when you have to talk to the president, how do you armor yourself, or how do you deal with it when he points at you and says you're fake news?
He didn't say that. He hadn't said that to us, but maybe Al can answer that question.
That's a challenging moment. I think that I'll say this briefly, then we'll take one more question. But I do think that in those moments, it's important to do two things, which is you got to stand up for yourself as a member of the press in a respectful fashion, especially at a news conference or something in that vein. But I also think you have to remember why you're there and what is your question. Why is he? The question is not get ticked off with fake news. The question is what is he not trying to answer by calling you fake news? Right? That's the point. So you got to. It's not about how the president feels towards you as a person or as a journalist. It's about what is the content and the information that you're trying to get, which links back, I think, to Jake and Anna's book. You guys were going after information, anecdotes, stories. Tell us what it was like to be inside the room, which is what you've done so well in this book. Let's take one more question, and then we'll get you guys signed and stuff.
You both talked about Nancy Pelosi's ability to hold together a caucus. Do you see that ability to do so decreasing going forward? In other words, do the Democrats have their own Freedom Caucus now?
I think potentially it'll be really interesting to watch, right? I think she's done a really good job so far of keeping them together on the big issues when it comes to immigration, when it comes to shutting down the government. But I do think you clearly see some very powerful freshmen in the sense of social media, and when you think about the celebrification, that's a word, of politics, whether that's AOC and some others. I don't think right now the Freedom Caucus, to remember, was organized and created to stymie leadership. Right now, you do not have the kind of left part of the Democratic caucus saying we are going to organize specifically so that we can thwart Nancy Pelosi. If that happens, you have the liberal equivalent of the Freedom Caucus.
Two things to add on to that. Number one, we quote Jim Jordan basically saying, in the Senate, one person can block anything. In the House, you need to have a big group that's willing to lock arms and say no. So it's basically, he compares it in our book. He says, we're conservatives, but we're a union. And that's a really good way to think about it. So Pelosi dismissively on Sunday night on 60 Minutes, I always can say Meet the Press when I mean 60 Minutes, on 60 Minutes said, there are about 5 of them. She was maybe being a little bit too dismissive. There isn't a lot more than 5 or 6 of them now. And as Anna said, they're not saying we're going to vote against her all the time. So, and Nancy Pelosi, I think better than anybody, sweats things out really well. If you remember back in 2009, 2010, when Democrats were pushing for the public option for healthcare, she let that process kind of play out until everybody kind of came along to her conclusion, which was, we're not going to get the public option. She just is willing to stare ahead at what she knows is going to happen and wait interminably until it does happen. She's the speaker again, right? That's a good example of that, I think.
I'm so excited for y'all to read Anna and Jake's book. You're going to love it, and we're so appreciative that you two took the time to answer our questions here tonight. So thank you guys so much. Thank you.